Hello, everybody. I hope all is going well, and I hope the gardening sound in the background isn't too disruptive. But what I want to take a look at today is we're going to continue our discussion on relationships. But more specifically, we're going to look at the idea of social institutions. It's a big part of what we look at in sociology. So we're going to be taking a look at institutions today. So I think generally we know what an institution is, maybe intuitively. But when I'm taking a look at institutions from sociology, there's two aspects to it. So institutions basically are the things that we find ourselves in every day. I'll give some examples in just a little bit. But there's two things about them. They could be physical spaces and they could be non-physical spaces. So as far as a physical space is, it could be a school building or a DMV office or a church or temple. It's really any physical space that we find ourselves in. However, in sociology, we take the next step. We also understand how they could also be non-physical ideological places. So these things that shape the rules and structures of our interactions and our activity. They shape our interactions and our activity. The important part here I want to emphasize, we're going to talk about in detail in this lecture, is they provide a framework of which we understand ourselves and how we relate with other people. Okay, so we'll give some examples of this. So in general, when we're thinking about institutions, if we they could sometimes be, of course, both physical and non-physical at the same time. So if we think about a school, we'll be talking about a school a lot throughout. So physically, you think of a school building, and perhaps a school building, but perhaps you also think about things like the classroom itself, the cafeteria. You get the idea. But the ideological part, how school also shapes us, is it helps us think about how relationships look. And you think of, we'll go in detail later, but you think of maybe the primary relationship in a school is a teacher-student relationship. So an institution shapes our understanding not only of how we are physically in a space, but also how we interact with each other. So for instance, a student interacting with a teacher is going to look a lot different than perhaps a student interacting with another student. And you might even think about this same self for yourself when we think about families or at a church. All these different institutions come with themselves different forms of relationships, different rules of how we act. So we're going to kind of break that down and see how social institutions shape how we understand ourselves and how we understand each other, and therefore how we work with each other. So I'm going to split here. We're going to do a quick little look at here and kind of further going into distinguishing between ideological and physical. So I have it broken up here between physical and ideological. So ideological could also mean, if you break it down, quite simply ideas. So we'll hold that in mind. So I only separate them here to kind of get to the greater idea of what an institution is. But often institutions are both and. They're both physical and ideological, but sometimes looking at the different aspects, the physical aspects versus the ideological aspects, can help us break it down a little bit more closely. So if we think about systems of control, so for instance, military, prison, or the police, these are more physical. These are direct control through force. So when you have something physical, when you think about being controlled or directed, physical things like police or prison are direct ways that we're controlled. Overt or direct. Okay. So if you're thinking about doing something, some direct force that might stop you from doing something illegal, for example, might be something like the threat of the police. Okay. Whereas ideological control, ideas, can be more subtle. Maybe it's a little bit more hidden. For instance, in religion, you may learn what right and wrong is. Parenting, you might get a similar story from parenting. Same thing with schooling. These give you certain ideas of how you're supposed to act and how you're not supposed to act, but it may not be as direct. And of course, these can also intersect. So for instance, schooling control could end up being something referring you to the police. That could be a more direct control. But the basic idea is institutions encompass both of these things. Institutions cover this whole idea. institutions in society cover both physical and ideological forms of control. Okay, so how does this affect relationships? Let's go into the next page here. So how does that happen? Where does control come from? So when we think about control, when we think about institutions, we also think about rules. Ideology and rules are related with each other. So basically then, each institution tends to have rules of interaction or ways of properly relating with other people. So within each of these institutions, anywhere in society, they all have rules. Well, I'll go into the schooling one in a second, but for instance, if you go to the grocery store, that is an institution that also has rules. For instance, if you go fill your cart full of food, and you proceeded to walk right out the door without paying for it, that would be something that was wrong. That would be a form of interaction that you're not supposed to do. Or if you went right up to the grocery checkout line and cut in front of everybody and just started checking yourself out, that would also be something that was inappropriate. So a grocery store comes with a set of rules that regulate how you do shopping, regulate how you interact with other people. And in some ways, we learn how to do this just by being there. We see maybe what's appropriate or inappropriate. Maybe we learn from movies or films or parents on how you're supposed to act in these places. And if you don't, there's consequences. They may not be dire consequences, but there's consequences. So each of these things come with a set of rules that tell you how to interact with people. And again, we're going to be using schooling example throughout since we all have experience with that. So for instance, in schooling, teachers have more power than a student and therefore controls the way students and teacher relate. So often the teacher has more power than the student just because of the institution itself. So when we actually go into school, we know in some ways that teachers are above students. Just because the way we end up learning from the earliest age, the teacher is in the front of the class, students sit back, watch, and listen. There's a more extreme form of institutions that we'll briefly talk about here that maybe help drive home the point. These are called total institutions in sociology. So a total institution is maybe perhaps the prime example of what an institution can be. So if you think institution, a total institution is the maybe quote perfect example. The reason I say this is because it controls all aspects of a way a person interacts. So one of the main ones we talk about in sociology is often prison. Oh, not prison, but prison. Prison is often is thought of as a total institution. Prison, maybe a lesser extent than military. So when you think about these things, sociologists think about a prison because every aspect of your life is regulated. When you get up in the morning, go to sleep at night, you're all within the same institution. Similarly, in the military is also a form of something that's a total institution where all your interactions are within it. So in a total institution, all interactions, all experiences are within the institution. So this is a perfect example of an institution, because if you think about a prison and how that might shape how you relate with people, prisoner with a guard, prisoners with their prisoners, every aspect of it's going to be controlled. I want to emphasize, though, that an institution doesn't have to be total for have tremendous influence on us, like with our other examples of schooling or work, for example, are also things that have tremendous influence, but they don't necessarily have to be a total institution. Okay, so let's take a closer look then at a schooling institution. So if we're going to think about this, let's break this down a little bit further. So since we're talking about relationships in marriage and family, how do we break down a relationship in an institution? How are these things related with each other? Okay, so as we've already covered, Institutions shape the rules of a relationship. They have a profound effect on how we see the world, also therefore have a profound effect on how we relate with each other. They influence us, as we've said, physically and ideologically, to shape how we see ourselves and each other. So schooling is a great example of this. So if we're to think of the institution, in this case schooling, let's think of the primary relationship here. In this case, I'm going to take a look at the student-teacher relationship. So if we're going to draw our little stick figures that we always do, we think then of our student and our teacher, T for teacher, S for student. If we think about our relationship here, how does the teacher relate with the student? In this case, the knowledge and information discussions often go one way. So if you ever think about your experience in most classrooms, when you come into a classroom, the students all sit in front in the class, if these were the desks all arranged, and generally the teacher is up front talking to all of the students. So these are all students at the desk. So in this case, the teacher ends up becoming more valuable and knowing more than the students themselves. So in this case, the teacher is more valuable, the student is less valuable. The teacher knows all, and the student knows little. So this ends up setting a precedent for how you're going to interact. So maybe from the earliest days, from kindergarten, all the way up to now we're in college, we have this dynamic where the teacher is always more valuable than the student. So what happens then when you graduate? What kind of relationships are you used to? So for instance, if you're used to, since we're in schooling from K to 12 most of the day, if we're used to having interactions where we are less valuable than or no less than a person for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for the majority of our lives, what is that going to set us up for? Okay, so some theorists that take a look at this, let's look at an example. If we're to extend this now, so if we're looking at schooling versus the workplace, schooling here may be the primary relationship. So as we noticed before, the teacher and the teacher and the student. So we see here the interaction goes one way. The teacher is more valuable, knows more. So like I said, if we've been doing this for almost 20 years of our life, what does that result in? We think then of how that transfers into the workplace. So you graduate, go into the workforce, and many of us may have already done so. What is the next primary relationship that we experience in the workplace? A boss and worker. So what does that look like? W for worker, B for boss. We get a similar dynamic, right? Where the boss is the one directing the worker. The boss is more valuable, worker less valuable. The boss knows all, and the worker knows little. And perhaps, unlike in schooling, if you question the boss's intentions or knowledge, you could lose your job, right? So in both cases, you end up with a dynamic hierarchy. A term we might explore a few times. Hierarchy just means order of value. Therefore, in this relationship, the first one, the teacher is on top and the student's at the bottom. In the second example, the boss is on top and the worker is on the bottom. So one is more valuable than the other. We have a lot of hierarchies in society where one is considered more valuable than another. So if we start transferring hierarchies from the first example, teacher and student hierarchy, you spend all those years in it, and go into the boss-worker hierarchy, order of value. And these are your experiences of relationships. How is that, get to this last part here, how does that then affect our society? Right? What kind of society are we going to have if we're only experienced in having hierarchical relationships where a teacher or a boss or some other figure is more valuable, more important than we are? How is that going to affect us? So while institutions and society themselves aren't necessarily, you don't have to follow these rules, and we don't necessarily see them as influencing us like this. In sociology, we take this seriously because then we end up seeing that over time, these primary relationships that we have end up affecting how we see the world. So moreover, not just in society, but then how does this affect our primary relationships? How does this affect a relationship with your parent? How does it affect a relationship with a child or a spouse? So if we're talking about marriage and family, how are these relationships then affected if all of our experiences are shaped in such a way? Okay, so then the final idea here, implications and discussions. So, implication, the conclusion. So we can conclude that institutions fill our everyday, are tremendously influential not only on who we become, and in some ways they form the borders of our personality, and they outline our identities. Let's think about that. They shape who we become, and in some ways form the borders of our personality. They outline our identities and who we are. Though, as we saw, many of these aspects may be invisible, but they still leave an indelible mark on who we become and how we relate with others. Right? Even thinking back with Buber's I, it versus I, thou, what does that look like? Right? How, if we're always working with this sort of relationship, how are we supposed to get here? Right? Okay, so question then. Thinking about some of the institutions you've been a part of, so this could be any. It could be schooling, as we've talked about. It could be religion, the institution of marriage, the military, etc. How are these institutions? How have these institutions shaped who you are and what you become? Okay, how might they shape who you are and what you become? How might these affect your relationships that you're in, and how you relate with your friends, family, or co-workers? So if we're relating in this spot, if we're existing in the I-it, how can we then transcend that into different sorts of relationships? So you could also think about this back to our suitcase and our baggage. So things like gender, education, experiences, things that we brought with us. And in this case, we could even add what institutions we've been a part of. How do these institutions affect what we carry with us? Not only what we choose to carry with us, how we carry ourselves, and the implications for what that means for our primary relationships. So what does that mean for being a parent? What does it mean for being a child, a good spouse or partner? What does that mean for our primary relationships?